The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning or good evening, depending on when you are, and welcome to today's editorial webinar, The Importance of Identity and Interoperability in IoT, produced by the Wireless Broadband Alliance. My name is Adlan Fela. I'm founder of Maravidis and Wi-Fi 360, and I'll be moderating the event today. We have an exciting program for you with very experienced speakers who are very active in working with the WBA working groups to help materialize the vision of roaming and interoperability for IoT. After all four speakers have presented, we will open the event for Q&A. I thus invite you to submit your questions throughout the event, as we'll be selecting them at the end. I also remind our audience that this webinar will be recorded and available for replay along the slides. So without further ado, I will hand it over to our first speaker, Bruno Thomas, Senior Manager PMO for the Wireless Broadband Alliance. Bruno?
Yeah, thank you so much, Adlan. Hello, everyone. So today I'll be providing you with the context on how WBA is addressing the Internet of Things space. That naturally, given our heritage, derives in a strong focus on interoperability and roaming. So to start with, on the first slide, basically what we try to do here is to develop an industry benchmark to assess the different ecosystem players' positioning. And what you can see in this chart is the categorization of these players across the different layers. So basically, we start with the devices and network interfaces, and there are players focusing purely on connectivity, so mostly roaming between mobile operators. Then we have the access network focused on radio technology that goes up to the core platform and servers, so a way to extract information from the devices, making them available to the different platforms. Then we have the access network, but more focused on communication protocols, so new organizations that are focusing on IoT and making this information available to third parties via APIs, for instance. And finally, we also identify two pillars, which are the IoT technical frameworks that go end-to-end from the devices up to the services layer, and also the IoT interoperability and roaming. And as I will point out on the next slide, where WBA is trying to position as framework agnostic. So on the next slide, what you can see is basically a positioning of the different IoT stakeholders, and then how WBA intends to position. So this is just some example of the players that position in the different areas of the IoT ecosystem, and then what WBA tries to achieve. If we just move one animation forward, please. So yeah, as you can see here, what we are trying to develop is basically with the IoT services now beginning to take shape. We are looking into down the IoT value chain, and in our vision, the role of Wi-Fi and another unlicensed technology in supporting IoT is really to be framework agnostic. So basically what we develop and the report we just put out is regarding how an interoperability and roaming framework can be applied independently of the organization that you can see in these different blocks. So that's our vision. Having said this, on the next slide, what we have also planned is really that our guidelines work. We have been developing WBA very focused on services deployments, best practices supported by our common set of members could help. We also perform trials that have an end-to-end perspective. And basically our experience with developing next generation Wi-Fi trials will certainly be easily translated to the IoT world, where here on the block number 3, we bring up the interoperability. So all the roaming work we developed for Wi-Fi, it's now evolving to a concept of the licensed wireless. And in fact, our RICS framework, so the wireless roaming intermediary exchange, we are discussing with some of these organizations on how we could help them doing all the financial and data clearing, the interconnect, So we are trying to apply that to the IoT world. And finally, the way we see this evolving is also through compliancy, and we have a Carrier Wireless Services Certification Program that we are currently working to include some of the most relevant IoT use cases. So in the end, companies can use this program and use an independent organization to improve the issues they are seeing in real world implementations. So these are the set of core competencies we would like to make available to the IoT ecosystem. And just to sum up, so these are our current work streams. So we have just concluded the IoT new vertical value chains and interoperability is available. You can download it. You will learn about interoperability and roaming, naturally identities, and also some of the models for monetization. So I think you will learn also the key priorities that operators and technology vendors are seeing on this space, with a strong focus on the unlicensed wireless. Then on the right-hand side, and there's a call for action. That was just the work stream we are starting is really an effort trying to define a technical framework to address IoT service interoperability and roaming. So this project has started in February, so it's in the beginning, it's open for enrollment. And certainly we would welcome you if you have inputs and know-how and would like to influence, we would invite you to join this work. And then I think basically about the WBA, the Wireless Broadband Alliance. So it's certainly a place where you can learn and leverage, engage, and influence. So we have a set of 4 programs that you can see have a strong focus on carrier Wi-Fi services, next generation wireless, connected cities and Internet of Things, policy spectrum, and industry engagement. So our membership is quite diverse. We have mobile operators, fixed operators, we have leading technology vendors, so it's a quite unique mix of members. And all in all, I think this results in a unique and diverse group able to drive the industry forward. So feel free to contact us if you would like to learn more and engage on the activities. These are some of our contacts, and with this introduction, I would also like to thank the speakers that work with us on these topics and will provide an in-depth perspective and overview on how WBA is working on this IoT space. And yeah, thanks, Adlan.
Thank you, Bruno, for sharing your vision with us. And so now we'll have the opportunity to go into more details with our next speaker, Mark Grayson, who's distinguished engineer with the CTO team at Cisco. Mark, it's all yours.
Thanks, Adlan. As you say, I'd now like to switch gears and dig into the detail of the work WBA did as part of this analysis into IoT. And first, a little bit about the title. I think we didn't want this to be just about access technologies. I know there are plenty of papers out there that compare and contrast the different connectivity options. Rather, we first wanted to step back and look at the value chains in IoT and see how those were evolving. I think we all recognize that IoT propositions aren't just about connecting things. And so how does that transition really impact the required functionality that is going to be necessary to address these new opportunities? And just a bit about framing. We frame this project. This is the first WBA project underneath the broader WBA strategic priorities. If we look at WBA's Vision 2020, which was published back in 2015, we really formulated the scope of this project to align with those strategic priorities. We looked at the remit to diversify, not only in use cases, because clearly we're moving on from purely connectivity-centric sort of carrier Wi-Fi to look at IoT, but also we didn't just look at 802.11 and Wi-Fi based technologies in this particular piece of work. As it comes to unlicensed, we looked at other alternative unlicensed technologies, including LoRa, Wi-Fi, Zigbee, Bluetooth, and others. And of course, when we look at monetization aspects as it relates to IoT, we need to look at those capabilities that are going to be needed to be able to monetize the investment into those systems and networks. One of the issues we faced, and I guess it comes as no real surprise to anyone, is really the breadth of the IoT landscape, and we certainly did engage the WBA members, stakeholders, in terms of really how to prioritize our work within this very broad IoT environment. We actually used some earlier work from Beecham Research, which tried to segment this broad IoT landscape, and I think Beecham started off with 9 individual market segments. We polled our members and highlighted here are 5 segments that were reported as experiencing rapid growth in terms of IoT adoption, being healthcare, industrial, building, home, and energy. And then when we sort of dig down, even within one market segment, we see further subcategories of applications that are leading IoT adoption. And finally, we see the breadth of access technologies which are currently being used to address the various opportunities. Yes, we see Wi-Fi in its traditional flavors operating at 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, but we also see 802.11ah, also known as Halo, which is 802.11 operating below 1 gigahertz to provide extended range for IoT, but also 802.11ad, which is Wi-Fi flavor operating in 60 gigahertz. And then we also see Zigbee, Wi-SUN-based 15.4 networks and Bluetooth low energy. And of course, we see cellular being used to address these particular opportunities. So with this real broad environment, how do we map these different market segments, different use cases, and different access technologies? Well, what we did is we determined a set of application requirements based on 8 key criteria covered here in terms of coverage, scalability of power, throughput, reliability, determinism, cost, and security. And so this chart shows those 8 categories and maps those against the various different unlicensed access technologies. And first, this table shows that for each application, there can be more than one candidate access technology, which could address its requirements. But we can see some key groupings of access technologies. If we look at sort of 802.15.4 networks, really these can be applicable for IoT applications where you need scalability, large number of devices, typically low throughput, low cost, low power are really the main requirements. For wide area coverage, high scalability, thinking about smart cities here, the low power wide area network technologies could be the right fit. And then for the high throughput applications, Wi-Fi is currently the only choice with reasonable coverage, however, at a higher cost in terms of power consumption. Now, obviously, we've all seen and heard the focus the industry has given to the evolution of cellular systems to support IoT requirements with the definition of narrowband IoT. But importantly, from the WBA's perspective, this piece of analysis published by Ericsson indicates that from a North American perspective, while cellular-based network connectivity is being driven by the connected vehicle use cases, so connected cars, connected trucks, and fleet use cases, it's really the non-cellular connectivity will dominate in terms of absolute numbers. Surprising here that it's only less than 15% of all IoT connections in 2020 will use cellular, and the rest are predicted to use unlicensed technology. And if we dig into those more so, of those unlicensed technologies, 70% are estimated to use Wi-Fi, 25% will be using short-range unlicensed like Zigbee, and then 5% will be using the low-power wide area. So interesting observations there. Next slide. Now, as part of the work we did for IoT, back in 2016, we surveyed the WBA members. Feedback was predominantly from operators, as you would expect, but we did get feedback from hub operators, aggregators, and some infrastructure vendors. Respondents really were across all geographies with a focus of individuals on strategy and R&D roles. You can obviously download the full results of the survey in the report that Bruno provided a link to earlier. But here we capture some key takeaways from that survey. Unsurprisingly, I think we see there's been a real increase in priority associated with IoT reported by the survey respondents, but we see real progress in terms of really delivering commercial products and services to address IoT opportunities, with 60% of operators having immediate plans for IoT-based offerings. From a technology roadmap perspective, as you would imagine from WBA members, there is a focus on Wi-Fi, but looking at the diversity of requirements and use cases, we do see reported interest in unlicensed low power wide area networks and Zigbee, but also cellular-based technologies with narrowband IoT and 3.5 gigahertz. And this is a topic that WBA has already covered in its coordinated shared spectrum piece of work. So interesting call out of using that piece of technology to address IoT use cases. And as it relates to roaming requirements, these are absolutely based on application by application basis, but over 90% of companies consider roaming to be important for certain use cases. And finally, in terms of market segments being focused on, the top three are consumer, home, then transportation and energy, with the general applications that are increasingly relevant are automotive, asset tracking, fleet management, and security systems. So I recommend everyone download the full report so they can see the full analysis of the survey results. So Bruno called out in his earlier slide the IoT ecosystem development, and so here we sort of map that into a vertical value chain. And I think what is evident here is that to date, WBA has been primarily focused on connectivity services with carrier Wi-Fi definition, next generation hotspot, and the like, all focused on that connectivity layer. But with IoT, we see value migrating out of the connectivity layer up the stack, as it were. Yes, connectivity is absolutely essential, but value is migrating, and it's migrating into identity and service management. It's migrating into IoT enablement platforms, device management, billing, and analytics. And up to where the real value of IoT is really in those customized vertical applications. I think this is where some of the real challenges comes from an operator perspective, from a carrier perspective. If you want to be where the real value is, then you need to go vertical. But it means when you go vertical, it doesn't necessarily mean you're able to scale. And so what the industry is looking at is the need to have a horizontal platform that can be applied across those verticals. And so, hence we see interest in the industry of being able to provide those enablement platforms, across segments and use cases. And just from a Cisco perspective, that's certainly how we view this with our Jasper control center propositions, where now Jasper Control Center is agnostic in terms of the particular access technologies, and is being expanded to support both SIM-based cellular as well as non-SIM-based devices moving forward. So interesting in terms of value migration. So this is now looking at the very top tier. So where value has migrated up from connectivity all the way to the top of those vertical applications. And even when we get to that stage, we see some clear demarcation in terms of the phasing of IoT propositions. I think pretty much everyone agrees, the first and kind of the easiest of IoT propositions are all around operational efficiencies, how to reduce resource consumption, particularly around power usage, and that's where we see sort of IoT being used for outdoor street lighting applications, the HVAC control. But also we see other use cases which are around decreasing resource wastage in production facilities. So moving on from phase one, we get to phase two, and this is really looking at new products and services, and that transformation is really enabled when every product offers connectivity, and that connectivity really enables new opportunities for businesses to be able to interact with existing customers. And a great example is that car example, the connected car. You know, traditionally, your engagement with a vehicle manufacturer, it essentially ended after you purchased the car. Maybe you had, you know, an annual service with one of their garage operators, but really a very limited engagement. Now with a connected car, you can really use that as a service with remote diagnostics. And now as a user, you really have a continued relationship with the manufacturer, and then the manufacturer sees increased lifetime value of each individual customer. And so driving, you know, everything that was sold as a product is now going to be delivered as a service. Phase three is about sort of outcome-based offerings, and this is where we start to apply analytics to IoT problem space. You know, not only am I instrumenting the system, but I've modeled the system, the causality, and therefore I can start to offer greater value in terms of, say, predictive maintenance, looking in particular at industrial automation processes and selling, you know, IoT outcomes on decreased production line downtime, or examples of, you know, cold storage company which is monitoring its thermostats, evaporators, fans, and compressors, really to reduce unplanned failures. And finally into stage four, phase four, you know, not only do I then have the analytics and the modeling, but I can actually remove the human from that control loop and move into effectively improved operations. And so here we see really the target as really those asset intensive industries, those expensive assets which need you know, optimum utilization, where machinery cost is high. So looking at some oil and gas sectors, we see as being sort of the early adopters of those autonomous optimization type offers. So really to wrap, you know, so this has been from the IoT evolution of vertical value chains and interoperability, you know, the first project sitting under WBA's Vision 2020, absolutely addressing diversification, you know, the evolving role of Wi-Fi, not just in providing carrier Wi-Fi and next generation hotspot connectivity, but being used to support IoT, as well as other unlicensed wireless services to deliver those new value chains. Acceleration in terms of next generation Wi-Fi, and with a focus on monetizing by non-traditional approaches, because we're recognizing there are some use cases which drive traditional monetization approaches in terms of connectivity models, but there are others where I'm valuing IoT in terms of an outcome-based proposition. And finally, you know, building on WBA's authority and leadership, really augmenting the focus moving forward is to how do we take the work that WBA has done in terms of simplifying the onboarding of smartphones into a next generation hotspot environment, and be able to augment those definitions to simplify the onboarding of IoT devices into an IoT environment. And as Bruno calls out, that is some of the work that's currently ongoing within WBA as part of its dynamic roaming and IoT project. So hopefully you found that interesting. And with that, I will pass you back to Adeline.
Thank you, Mark. Lots of good details here, which are certainly generating lots of questions from the audience. Our next speaker, Brian Shields, is Director of Engineering and Custom Platforms at the Boingo Wireless, who is a Wi-Fi and DAS aggregator. Brian?
Thank you, Adlan. Good day, everyone. My name is Brian Shields, and I'm co-leader at WBA IoT Working Group and also Director of Engineering at Boingo Wireless. where I help to get our customers online and with the best experience possible. At Boingo, we're always working to expand value to our customers to stay relevant in a fast-changing field. That's why we were interested in joining the WBA with this IoT working group. We have a personal relationship with the IoT, and we're excited to work with the WBA and its partners to help drive innovation and standardization and interoperability with the other unlicensed wireless tech that we provide our customers today. And the following questions that we're considering when formulating how can we anticipate growth. First, on the value chain, how can we add value and unlicensed to accommodate the IoT, and how it might be monetized? For identity, how can we manage the diverse set of identities that encompass the IoT? And interoperability, how would interoperability play into roaming for the IoT as well as its services and machine-to-machine communication channels? Our use cases are as diverse and fragmented as the IoT itself. In earlier work, we've attempted to cover the basic roaming use cases across several verticals. And that gives us the context when considering the roaming aspects with IoT devices. And with roaming, how can we use next generation hotspot standards to extend to the IoT? So what I'm showing you now is the hype cycle of emerging technology. It's used by Gartner for representing maturity, adoption, and social application of technologies. So it starts with the technology trigger. Early proof of concepts, stories, and media interest trigger significant publicity. Often no usable products exist and commercial viability is unproven. Then we move to the peak of inflated expectations. This is where publicity produces success stories. They're often accompanied by scores of failures. Some companies take action, most don't. The trough of disillusionment. This is where experiments fail. Investments continue only if surviving providers improve their products for early adopters. The slope of enlightenment. The tech is understood. Second and third generation products appear from providers, and more enterprises fund pilots. Conservative companies still remain cautious. And the plateau of productivity. Main Street adoption starts to take off. The technology broad market starts to pay off. For example, in 2007, when you look at some of the products that are along this hype cycle, you can see at the technology trigger side, media distribution by game console, where the Nintendo Wii was probably one of the first platforms to offer media distribution, was on the technology trigger. And you can see along the hype cycle where other products have been plotted with household Wi-Fi on the far right and the plateau of productivity. So this just gives a little bit of context to this. The IoT appeared in 2011, in between the technology trigger and peak of inflated expectations. And then by 2015, it had moved to the very peak and still remains 5 to 10 years before viability is considered. There's also an IoT specific hype cycle where a lot of the technologies have been dispersed along the hype cycle, and they're being tracked specifically on their own graph. As you can see, I think it's important to show that a lot of the technologies are still early and have not been completely adopted, at least to the point of the plateau of productivity. Gartner's other growth study forecasted that 8.4 billion connected things will be in use worldwide in 2017, and that's up 31% from their last forecast in 2016. This is supposed to reach 20.4 billion by 2020. And total spending on these endpoints and services are expected to reach almost $2 trillion in 2017. And it's pretty apparent what's to come. There's going to be a massive uptake in the IoT space, and Boingo wants to be where the puck is to support the scale of use on our networks. And we've done this before with Wi-Fi and NGH. So Boingo's been a leader in the promotion of Wi-Fi roaming since 2001. The concept of carrier-grade Wi-Fi has allowed operators to offload mobile data onto reliable crowdsourced Wi-Fi hotspots. And Boingo has also led Passpoint and NGH technologies, which it started in early 2012 by getting onto Hotspot 2.0. We've been involved with the WBA, participating in several technical, marketing, and business work groups, contributing to standards, writing white papers, and taking the initiative to collaborate on Passpoint activities. The Wi-Fi roaming ecosystems shows there are three primary stakeholders. The home service provider, and this is the home network. And then you have the visited Wi-Fi provider. This is the network that you would roam onto. And then the hub and clearinghouse, which sits in between and accounts all of the usage between the networks and reconciles the data and usage across the visited Wi-Fi networks, and ensures that providers can get paid and users can get billed. And the WBA has led the industry in traditional roaming growth and adoption, and this is in part due to the collective strengths of its members to develop the RICS framework, which is the Wireless Roaming Intermediate Exchange. And this specifies the roaming and data clearing standards. It contains useful templates for roaming agreements and describes financial and technical details. It also considers important issues such as security and architecture, user experience, and more. It's comprised of these specifications. Along the bottom, moving up is the RICS-I radius interconnection specification, and then RICS-L, which is the location feed and file exchange specification. RICS-D is the data clearing specification, and RICS-F, which is the financial settlement specification. And then there's also another layer that is still in draft called the RICS-N, which is the network operator specification for deployment practices. And this all defines the standards and specifications for roaming agreements. The next-gen hotspot expansion to incorporate IoT services as a feature would allow operators the value-added benefit of enablement of their customers' IoT devices and service interoperability. NGH as a concept is secure, seamless, and interoperable, leveraging on industry consensus, and these lessons should be taken into the IoT scope. It contains specifications for provisioning, security, and authentication. Some other considerations for IoT roaming and interoperability are the following. First, we need automated, seamless authentication for devices without screens. The IoT is set to trigger diversification in terms of endpoints being connected to the wireless network, compared to earlier mobile broadband tailored offers where devices are assumed to have some display and user input capabilities. Many of the constrained devices used in the IoT will have limited input-output capabilities, and web-based authentication or splash page acknowledgement of terms and conditions will inhibit the IoT connectivity solutions. Boingo's networks in the military barracks need to work with consumer IoT devices like the Amazon Echo, but we don't have a solution for non-Wi-Fi devices yet. Emerging standards for IoT roaming. The LoRa Alliance is defining an end-to-end system for supporting LoRaWAN-based air interface, and is currently defining back-end interface specifications that will deliver standard, secure, and authentic interface between various core components. Interoperability using application gateways. The gateway as a network proxy approach is necessary where non-IP data IoT devices need to communicate with back-end machine-to-machine services and applications. And then the back-end sharing and interoperability. A federated cloud IoT service requires not only standard protocols to eliminate data silos, but also common information models to enhance interoperability in the Internet of Things at the application layer. On the identity side, it's pretty fragmented. A list of common identity methods to support range of IoT use cases are as such, and more information can be found at WBA's white paper, IoT Chains and Interoperability. Wi-Fi systems are identity managed by MAC address or they're tied to an account. For an IoT, the concept of identity could involve more aspects. They could be identified by a universal integrated circuit card instead. They may also require the incorporation of context where users have things. This relationship would beget specific policy controls that require the relationship to be identified in order to allow the thing access to its backend services. This paradigm shift would force a makeover of the roaming standard and would necessitate consideration of identity and access management as well as identity relationship management. And some have become to refer to this new identity ecosystem as the identity of things. Well, thanks for your time. If there are any follow-on questions regarding the presentation or any of the work that we're doing with roaming, you can reach me directly here. I would also like to invite anyone to join the WBA if you haven't, and more specifically the IoT roaming group, where we're planning on trialing some roaming solution. And thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Brian. And so last but not least, our next speaker is Chris Bruce. He's co-chair of the Wireless Broadband Alliance, as well as director of global services with British Telecom. And Chris, I believe you're going to share with us real-life examples of how to monetize and foster IoT. Thank you. Over here.
Okay, thanks, Adlan, and hi everyone. Thanks for joining this call. As Adlan says, I'm representing both BT and the Wireless Broadband Alliance as co-chair. I'd like to talk to you about an operator's perspective of the Internet of Things. So if we can move on to the next slide, perhaps we should start by defining what it is. And essentially, I think it's really got three components. Starting at the bottom of this page, you've got the sensors and actuators, you've got the connectivity, and then you've got some analytics, something to make out of all of this data being collected. And sensors really have been around for ages, and they're collecting activity, something that has changed or something hasn't changed. Whether it's light, heat, movement, noise, proximity, location, indeed anything that you can measure. Actuators will then do something as a result. They control things, they turn things off, turn things on if something's changed. And what's changed with sensors and this whole activity is the ability to collect this data for central processing and analyzing what the data is telling you. And in fact, it's the availability of unlicensed spectrum at relatively low cost and technologies that can require relatively low power to send small packets of data have really created the opportunity for new services to be imagined and business models created. And almost as a response, there's been a significant developments in the cellular network standards and technology, making available enhancements to LTE, which leverage 4G networks already deployed and spectrum already secured. So you can see that the advances can be made there relatively quickly. All of this offers opportunities for mobile applications where a wide or nationwide coverage is required for transport, tracking, logistics, distribution. But it's the increasing network alternatives and the reduction in connectivity costs, especially when carrying these small packets of data, that mean a great deal of data can be collected across a wide area and a wide range of applications. The question is then, what do you do with all this information and how do you gain some sort of service or business benefit as a result? This is where data science and advanced computing power comes into play. And the introduction of cloud-based services, the reduction in cost of storage and processing costs means that data can now be analyzed in near real time and decisions can be made and action taken. And of course, with the increasing development of artificial intelligence, this action could be taken without human intervention at all. So perhaps we go to the next slide. And before you ask, metaphorically speaking, why have I got a picture of a chicken and a beer keg? Well, this is not a metaphorical question about which came first, the chicken or the keg. It's actually an illustration that the IoT is part of our everyday life already, and we may not even notice it. BT is working with 2 business clients today to improve their processes. One is a chicken farmer with thousands of chickens who wants to make sure the environment for his chickens is optimal, because I guess happy chickens lay more eggs, which leads to a happier farmer. So we're working with him to sense temperature, humidity, and other factors that affect chicken welfare. And if they're not within the right tolerance levels, he can then do something about it. And with thousands of chickens, more happy chickens, the better. Very simple, but key to making changes to optimize the environment for these chickens. Similarly, we're working with a major beer brewer to sense the location, age, and distribution of beer, because like a lot of food and beverages, stock doesn't last forever, and managing the beer stock and making sure that the oldest beer is put into distribution first and not going to waste is key to the efficiency and the profitability of the business. So next slide, please. So how does all this technology work? As was indicated already by Mark, there's a wide range of wireless technologies available to collect information for this IoT world. And it goes everything from the very slow but very cheap to the very fast and I guess less cheap type of networks. And there are different characteristics for all of these different networks, and they will require higher or lower power to transmit more data. So there's a trade-off for an operator to look at the cost, performance, speed, data coverage, handover equation for each use case, because getting information about a light bulb being ready for replacement is a different order of importance to knowing that actually there's something wrong with your heart pacemaker, or a security application, or a financial application. So there's different requirements depending on the use case. And network interoperability in this environment will be key, which is where the WBA comes in. With its history of creating the RICS specifications for roaming and interoperability, which Brian mentioned just now. That was originally for Wi-Fi roaming and seamless handoff from cellular to unlicensed Wi-Fi, unlicensed spectrum-based Wi-Fi. But the same sort of principles can be an excellent starting point for how we manage this complex world in the Internet of Things. And the WBA's membership of a diverse group of operators from different parts of cellular, Wi-Fi, fixed, and all the technology partners with us are giving us a comprehensive view of how this can be done. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. How does all this technology work again? Well, it's a whole ecosystem here. You've got the devices, whether they are big devices like trucks or little devices like smart watches, and all things in between, whether they're infrastructure-based sensors, whether they're things that move, things that shouldn't move, buildings and so forth. And they're all collecting data connected by a range of different networks. And for BT, we occasionally would use a mobile network, we use a fixed network, and we may well use unlicensed spectrum networks, whatever we think is appropriate for that particular application. And then you get into the point of, well, how do you manage all this data, the device security, the different types of data formats, the APIs, integrating that real-time messaging of what you do once you've spotted something, and this information exchange. How do you then monetize the data to make it available to partners in an ecosystem in a way that's going to be useful and valuable? And this is the essence of the platform for the Internet of Things. And of course, security and cloud-based services is key in a world where increased connectivity is great, but security is essential. So if we could just move on, please. And despite all these complex examples that we've talked about, sometimes it's better to start with something simple and maybe start with something at home. So BT, like a number of operators, can be intensive users of IoT themselves, when looking at simple examples of asset tracking and management. And if you're a company the size of BT, you realize that actually you've got a lot of things around the place. When it comes to cable drums, we apparently have 55,000 of the things. When it comes to vehicles, we have 30,000 of our own, plus another 80,000 we manage on behalf of other utilities as a business. So a large number of vans and cars and trucks around the place. And when it comes to buildings and stores, we've got 7,000 of them. And you can imagine that there are many examples where we as a large corporate and a large operation can ourselves drive efficiencies by knowing where things are, tracking where things are, looking at the use of our vans and our trucks and whether our service teams are in the right place, the occupancy of our buildings, the temperature of our buildings, the lights on, the lights off in our buildings, the energy savings we can make, which of course is good for our own business, our accountants are happy, but also from a customer point of view, we can demonstrate real business benefits as a live use case to share with our enterprise customers. So if we can move on, please. But going into a more complex environment, future cities. This is a complex stakeholder environment. By now, we kind of know that the technology works, in inverted commas. Yes, there's work to do and work to interoperate, but essentially we know with enough proofs of concept that we know the technology works. What doesn't quite work yet is a joined up view of a city. It's a really complex environment. Right at the center, of course, is or should be the citizen or the visitor or the people in the city. But there are other service providers, a range of public bodies, whether they're local government, regional government, national government, delivering services, private enterprise, community organizations, all manner of things. And unlike a single enterprise, a municipal authority may not have all the levers to enable the deployment of a smart infrastructure, and equally importantly, may not have the budget for a single significant capital or OPEX spend. You know, its street furniture or lamppost may have been outsourced to a third party, the transport may be delivered by multiple operators, and funding may come from different sources. So the challenge is actually to identify the best ways of delivering the right service and funding it in a sustainable way. And then making sure that the citizen sees the value, because if the citizen doesn't see the value, then, you know, when the next time it comes around to election time, they won't support it. So this is really critical. So if we go on to the next slide, and on the next slide, we need to find a sustainable business model. Without that, it won't work. You know, it's great having government support to start pilots and start projects to show the way things could be done, but that won't last forever. So we have to find a sustainable model so that those deploying infrastructure and costs to collect data through the sensors are rewarded fairly by those that will use the data and see a value in it. And in the short term, you know, governments can stimulate projects, but we have to find a way for this business model to be sustainable in the long term, which is why BT has been participating in a number of future city projects with this in mind. So if we could go to the next slide, please. In a number of areas, we've been participating in programs in collaboration with the national government, with cities, with academia and private funding to explore how different use cases can be deployed, but more importantly, how we can find the route to value. In Milton Keynes, in the MK Smart project, BT partnered with Milton Keynes Council and the Open University to prove the deployment of a number of IoT-based use cases, smart parking, waste management, traffic congestion, and a number of others. together with a number of innovative startups and other technology partners. Of particular interest is the creation of an open data hub where BT worked with Open University to store, catalogue and retrieve data collected from these applications, combining it with data from public available sources like the weather or traffic. This then has been open to citizens, communities, local SMEs to drive engagement and spur creativity in the search for a sustainable operating model to support applications. And more recently, in Manchester, a project was started last year called City Verb. BT partnered with Cisco as the key private sector participants to respond to the government's Innovate UK competition for smart city applications. Again, collaborating with the Manchester City and local academia to create applications to meet specific local needs and act as a use case for replication elsewhere. Again, with the data hub being absolutely central to it. City Verb is focused on a central part of the city and addresses issues around traffic, congestion, air pollution, public health, remote care, and will also engage with citizens in cultural aspects in the public realm with access to digital art and Wi-Fi. Again, addressing the thing the point that citizens need to be engaged in this, otherwise there won't be a long-term support for it. The data hub and how we manage that and make it available to stakeholders is critical to the long-term success of such deployments. A key enabler to ensuring that the data is collected, categorized, stored in a consistent way across a myriad of different devices and service types across sectors is key. And this is key to this is a standard way of recognizing devices and standardizing data formats that the device will present. So BT has supported the government's initiative to support HyperCat, along with companies such as Cisco, other operators, platform players, to create a new digital standard called HyperCat. Hype for hyperlink and cat for catalog. The standard is now maintained by the BSI, the British Standards Institute, who act as custodians. And I encourage the ecosystem to look at this standard as a common way of managing interoperability and data management in an area which will be key to the successful creation of a sustainable business model for IoT, especially where there's going to be multiple devices and data sources used. So if we could just move on, please. Another program is live in London now. The rollout's almost completed. It's called Things Connected London, and it's a program again where we're collaborating with public and private organisations to deploy an open network for innovation across London, using a low-power radio technology that you've heard of earlier in the call called LoRa, working with the Digital Catapult, which is a government agency to stimulate the digital sector. BT is working with EveryNet to deploy a London-wide network, and we're providing roughly half the sites for this network, including the BT Tower and the Olympic Park. And more than 100 organisations have signed up to deploy and test applications on this network for free. The British Research Establishment, the Building Science Centre, is also working with us, as are leading universities, to bring these use cases to life. Next slide, please. And finally, back to the WBA. We've created a body called the Connected City Advisory Board, bringing together international cities, operators and technology companies to create what we call a blueprint for connected cities. I mentioned earlier the complexity of the stakeholder environment. Well, we're trying to resolve that by bringing together representatives of different communities to create a blueprint for how to record best practice in terms of sharing knowledge and fostering private-public collaboration in what is a neutral environment. Because we feel if there is a template or a blueprint or blueprints in ways to approach cities, it may help us move forward to create a model for working together. So I encourage any stakeholders who have an interest in smart cities or connected cities or future cities to contact the WBA if you feel you have something to contribute or you'd like to learn more about this important work. So in conclusion, no single network will meet all use case needs. Interoperability and security will be key. Figuring out how to work interoperate these networks and collect data in a format that's going to be useful to be stored and reused. Partnerships will be crucial across horizontal and vertical value chains. Commercial models will have to be created to reward all players fairly, or it won't work. And operators really need to decide which part of the value chain they can play and how they can optimize that position in a sustainable way. So thank you for listening. I hope you, on behalf of the WBA and BT, this has helped you consider the role of the operator in the IoT value chain and the importance of interoperability and security in a sustainable business model. So with that, I shall hand back to Adlan for some Q&A.
Thank you, Chris. Perhaps BT may consider giving beer to those chickens to make them happy. So thanks to all our presenters today, for really sharing their vision and detailed work in progress, which have generated a number of questions from the audience. We'll start addressing that in a few minutes. Just to recap here, our presenters today have laid out a comprehensive view of the challenges and opportunities for roaming and interoperability for IoT. Companies, in general, are considering IoT service, network interoperability, and roaming very important for areas such as smart city and automotive in dense environments. The WBA has shared their vision of what it wishes to accomplish with IoT roaming and big data by leveraging all the great work they have done with Wi-Fi roaming, RICS, and NGH. All of this work is helping to evolve the world of Wi-Fi and unlicensed wireless services to embrace these new opportunities. So let's now address some of the questions from the audience, shall we? And perhaps start with this first one. What have been the most important lessons learned from the implementation of RICS so far? And perhaps Brian from Boingo can answer that one.
Yeah,
Brian?
Absolutely. So RICS specification is a great framework that can be extended and applied to really any unlicensed technology where roaming is a factor. In fact, we had a conversation with the LoRa Alliance, who is very interested in the RICS specification itself and how they can incorporate it into their own roaming systems.
Okay, great. For the sake of time, we'll probably just move on to the next questions here. Mark, can you tell us why is NGH important to make IoT roaming seamless? Can you hear me?
Sorry, Adlan, I was on mute. So if we look at NGH, the proposition was all around that seamless onboarding, predominantly for that smartphone type use case where that, the legacy environment had the splash page presented to the user and various sort of processes to get the user onto the network. NGH is all around removing that and making it seamless. And if we look at IoT, we recognize that connectivity is absolutely a fundamental for all of these IoT value chains. But now if we look at the devices, often they lack that display, that user input. You know, if we use Chris's example of his connected keg, there is no way for me to enter certain credentials into a browser window using conventional sort of web-based login tools that we see in Wi-Fi today. And therefore, I'd say that NGH is essential, and that seamless mobility is even more so as we enter into this world of IoT. And obviously, the work of WBA becomes more important as we transition from smartphone use cases to address the broader IoT landscape.
Thank you, Mark. Certainly does make sense in this very diverse environment of devices. We have a question here that's more business related. I think Bruce from BT can be the best person to answer that. How can stakeholders monetize IoT mobility and roaming?
Well, I think as I tried to lay out, and Mark also mentioned, you know, there's a whole value chain here, and I think it's for every player in the value chain to be really clear about where they offer value in that value chain, and what benefits they can drive, and from that see what return on investment. So you know, typically you'd expect an operator to be good at deploying and operating networks, perhaps having expertise around security to add to that. The question will be then, can they deploy a horizontal platform to support a number of different applications, because developing and deploying platforms for individual vertical applications would be tricky, probably hugely expensive if you just did that for chickens or beer. So you've got to look for the commonality there. And you know, I think you've got to be honest with yourself where value can be demonstrated and focus on that. Earlier in the presentations, we heard that the three most popular verticals were home, transport, and energy, and that was back in 2015. I suspect it's broadened since then. But again, I would look for where there are clear business cases, returns for your client, and work backwards and be honest with yourself about where you and your company can add value.
That certainly makes sense. And I'm sure the use cases will evolve over time as well. We've got a question that's probably best directed to WBAs. Bruno, can you share your agenda, roadmap for the Internet of Things Working Group, maybe for the next 12 months or so?
Yes, Adlan. So in fact, our roadmaps, we define them yearly. So for the Internet of Things, as Mark pointed out, is part of our Vision 2020. So it's a topic that we'll be focusing for the next set of years. So in fact, now as we address the dynamic roaming topic, what we have on the agenda to still achieve within a year period is basically to come up with a technical framework that then we can disseminate and then implement. And the way we see this happening is by hosting a multi-vendor trial. So that would be the major achievement we would like to put out to the industry within a year. But also the carrier wireless service certification, we see it evolving to IoT use cases, as I pointed out in the beginning, and that's where our members are basically convening and gathering as much input as possible, so we can come up with something relevant to the industry. So these would be the streams on the roadmap of the group that will pop out. But as I pointed out, so we are completely member driven. And the more feedback we receive and interest, things can be rearranged and then start even earlier. So yeah.
Great, Bruno, and I'm sure it's never too late to join the WBA if you're not a member yet. So those are open. And so I'm afraid we are at the top of the hour. This is all the time we have today. For all the questions that haven't been answered by the panelists, the WBA team will do a follow-up with you guys to try to address this question as soon as possible. I want to thank all the participants, all the audience for participating and listening to this webinar. I thank the panelists for sharing their views and vision and all the detailed work they're doing, and for the WBA to have given me the opportunity to moderate this great webinar today. Thank you very much, everyone.